think. 3,305. That is the number of UH-1 Hueys lost in the jungles of Vietnam. By the end of the conflict, nearly 50% of the entire fleet had been wiped out. Generals believed in a simple equation: speed plus altitude equals safety. They were wrong. Why did the air cavalry tactic fail so spectacularly? The answer lay in the landing zones. To drop infantry, the Huey had to hover. It became a static 5-ton target suspended over elephant grass. In the early 1960s, the UH-1 was just an airborne truck, a pilot, a co-pilot, and a crew chief. They hauled squads across rice paddies and trusted in sharp maneuvers to survive. But the flight paths were predictable. The North Vietnamese waited in the tree line with small arms and heavy machine guns. The transition from transport to target was instantaneous. One moment, a squad is jumping into the mud. The next, the fuselage is shredded by lead. Commanders realized the truck was defenseless. To save the machines, they would soon turn to the men standing in the open doors. By the end of the war, 1 out of every 2 helicopters sent to Vietnam never returned to base. Commanders realized speed was no longer a shield. They stripped the cabin of its barriers. They hung an M60 machine gun from a bungee cord. The crew chief leaned out into the wind to return fire. One gun covered one flank. It was not enough. What protected the man in the open doorway? Only his reaction time and a flak jacket that could not stop a rifle bullet. A 4th crew member climbed aboard, the shotgun rider, a designated door gunner to guard the opposite side. He became the helicopter's eyes and its teeth. He assisted pilots during landings. He maintained the turbines. He cleared the zone with lead. The gunner's world was a vibrating metal edge. He stood on the skids. His boots rested on 2,000 rounds of ammunition. He gripped the M60 spade grips. Every belt was a finite resource. Resupply mid-flight was impossible. The vibration of the machine gun traveled through his arms and into his bones. Beneath him, the jungle blurred. He was trained to lead targets from a moving platform, to compensate for physics and wind. Commanders offered ceramic chest plates for protection. They weighed 22 pounds. In 30-degree heat, the weight was suffocating. Many gunners left the armor on the staging pad. They chose mobility over a false sense of security. The contrast was lethal. The gunner was the primary defense of the Huey, yet he held the highest casualty rate of any position in the air. He was a human shield. A marksman hanging over an abyss, firing into the green canopy. Firepower soon escalated. Mechanics bolted on miniguns and 40mm grenade launchers. The curtain of steel grew denser during approach and takeoff. These were the seconds where the Huey stopped being a hunter and became a target. The gunner fired until the barrels glowed. He saved the helicopter, but he could not save himself. He remained a silhouette in a square hole. The position of the door gunner had reached its logical dead end. When human shields in the doors proved insufficient, field workshops began welding heavy weaponry onto transport frames. It was a desperate evolution. Mechanics in the mud of temporary airfields didn't wait for factory kits. They used spare mounts and salvaged parts. The UH-1B and UH-1C underwent a radical transformation. Transport helicopters became improvised killers. On the sides, they bolted rocket pods. Under the nose, they rigged 40mm grenade launchers. Could a transport machine truly suppress a jungle tree line? The answer was in the math of the Hydra 70 rockets. 2 pods carried 38 rockets. This single helicopter now delivered firepower comparable to a localized artillery battery. The mission profile shifted. These gunships flew ahead of the slicks. They hammered the landing zones with arcing grenade fire and high-explosive rockets. They cleared the perimeter so the troop carriers could survive the touchdown. They provided a wall of steel for ground units in trouble. Maintenance crews worked through the night to keep these overloaded frames in the air. The side doors still housed the M60 machine guns, but the primary punch came from the external racks. The goal was no longer just to ferry men, but to dominate the landing zone through raw saturation fire. The improvised gunships took on the burden of supporting ground forces under fire. The goal of the door-mounted weapons was saturation. But 38 rockets created a new enemy: physics. Heavy steel and high explosives stripped the Huey of its only defense: flight performance. Why did armed transport fail to become a permanent solution? Excess weight killed maneuverability. 1 ton of additional armament reduced hover time by 40%. The helicopter became a prisoner of its own firepower. Pilots could no longer hover over the landing zone to cover multiple waves of infantry. Fuel burned faster. Engagements were cut short. The Huey was designed to carry 10 men, not to act as a flying artillery battery. The airframe itself reached its limit. A wide transport profile turned the Huey into a slow, massive target for North Vietnamese machine guns. Vital systems remained exposed. A single rifle round could sever a hydraulic line or shatter a control linkage. Door gunners still hung out of open bays, protected by nothing but thin fatigues and hope. The tactical concept worked. Air cavalry proved that helicopters could dominate the jungle. But the troops needed a protector that could stay in the fight without dragging down the tempo of the entire operation. The Army leadership recognized the dead end and demanded a clean sheet design. They needed a dedicated attack platform with a narrow silhouette and armored vitals. The United States Army issued a formal request for a high-speed, heavily armed advanced aerial fire support system. Bell Helicopter found the solution by tearing the old Huey apart. From its carcass, they kept only the essentials: the T-53 engine, the rotor system, and the transmission. Everything else went to the scrap heap. The engineers at Bell reimagined the fuselage from scratch. They abandoned the wide, boxy cabin of the transport. Instead, they built a frame so narrow it looked like a blade cutting through the air. How do you make a helicopter a difficult target? You seat the pilots one behind the other and shrink the hull to a sliver of steel. The front view of the Huey showed a massive, blunt surface. The Cobra was a shadow. Its fuselage measured only 39 inches wide. That is less than 1 meter of target for a machine gunner on the ground. This narrow profile slashed aerodynamic drag and made the AH-1 nearly invisible from the front. Inside the cockpit, the seating followed a tandem logic. The gunner sat low in the nose, eyes on the sights. The pilot sat behind and above him, looking over his shoulder at the battlefield. This stepped-up configuration gave both men a panoramic view of the death zone. Speed rose to 170 miles per hour. This was no longer a flying truck. It was a specialized killer, carrying thousands of rounds and dozens of rockets. In the cockpit, the engineers added a final layer of insurance. Both crew members had a full set of flight controls. The first Cobras reached Vietnam in August 1967. They brought a tactical shift impossible for the slow, lumbering transport fleet. The AH-1 was not a modified utility craft. It was a purpose-built hunter. The chin turret rotated with lethal precision. It typically carried a 7.62 mm minigun or a 40 mm grenade launcher. Under the stub wings, the Cobra packed 4 pods of Hydra rockets. A full load meant 38 rockets and thousands of rounds of ammunition. Speed was its primary armor. The Cobra hit 170 miles per hour. It reached ambushed units twice as fast as ground reinforcements could move. The narrow silhouette hugged the terrain at low altitude. It stayed hidden behind the tree line, then popped up to strike from a blind spot. Unlike the Huey, the Cobra remained over the zone for multiple waves of insertion. It softened the landing site before the slicks arrived. It covered medevacs under fire. Commanders now had a platform more precise than a jet and more flexible than a gunship. The AH-1 proved itself as a reliable escort. Units began deploying the Cobra in aggressive new formations. The AH-1 transformed from a passive escort into a predator. This technical superiority birthed the most dangerous tactic of the war, the hunter-killer team. The roles were split by a lethal contrast. High above, the Cobra loitered in the safety of the clouds. Below, the OH-6A Loach skimmed the jagged canopy of the jungle. It was a live target. How do you find an enemy buried under a triple canopy forest? You use a helicopter as human bait. The Loach pilots flew at treetop level, sometimes so low the skids brushed the leaves. They listened for the metallic clack of an AK-47 bolt. They watched for a single muzzle flash. The high-pitched buzz of the Loach's engine was a deliberate provocation. It screamed for the North Vietnamese to open fire. The mechanics of the strike were surgical. Once the enemy bit, the Loach crew dropped a colored smoke grenade directly onto the muzzle flashes. They banked hard, pulling G-forces to escape the kill zone. From the sun-blinded heights, the Cobra dove. It followed the rising plume of purple or red smoke. 2.75-inch rockets and 7.62 miniguns erased the position in seconds. This evolution shifted the U.S. Army from defending landing zones to an active hunt. But the price for the scouts was staggering. The Loach was light, unarmored, and constantly exposed. Every mission was a calculated gamble with a high probability of a crash. The Army lost 964 AH-1 helicopters during the conflict. Sometimes, even perfect technology failed. Pilots like Larry Taylor had to break every instruction to save lives. June 18, 1968. Deep in enemy territory, a long-range reconnaissance patrol is surrounded. The North Vietnamese are closing the circle. Heavy fire pins the 4 soldiers down. No transport helicopter can reach them. The canopy is too thick. The fire is too intense. First Lieutenant Larry Taylor arrives in his Cobra. He is the hammer, but the nail is about to be driven in. Taylor and his wingmen dive. They fly low-level attack runs for 40 minutes. Tracers cut the humidity. Taylor uses artillery flares for illumination. The darkness flickers with magnesium light and muzzle flashes. Rockets gone. Ammunition exhausted. Fuel critical. The recon team is still trapped. Taylor looks at his fuel gauge and then at the clearing. A Cobra is a 2-seat weapon. It has no cabin, no passenger bench, no doors. How do you rescue 4 men with a machine designed only to kill? You turn it into a life raft. Taylor orders the team to a small opening in the brush. He flips on his landing lights. He becomes a glowing target to draw fire away from the soldiers. He jettisons his remaining weight. Every pound of fuel is a second of flight time. The Cobra drops into the clearing under a hail of bullets. There is no room inside. The 4 soldiers grab the rocket pods. They wrap their arms around the landing skids. They are hanging off a narrow fuselage in the middle of a firefight. 4 men clung to the outside of a gunship with 0 passenger seats. Taylor pulls pitch. The engine screams under the offset weight. He flies them out of the kill zone with 4 humans dangling over the jungle floor. He lands at a safe base with almost empty tanks. President Biden later draped the Medal of Honor around his neck. Larry Taylor's rescue mission proved one thing. A dedicated attack helicopter was no longer a luxury. It was a necessity. The Huey was a transport forced into a fight. The Cobra was a fighter built for the kill. What did Vietnam teach the Army? It taught them that a transport and a gunship must be 2 different machines. The war became a brutal laboratory. Thousands of lost Hueys and the blood of door gunners formed a new set of requirements. The military demanded more range. They needed advanced targeting. They wanted survivability against Soviet anti-aircraft systems. In the late 1970s, this evolution reached its peak. Engineers abandoned the thin skin of the Cobra for something heavier, something more lethal. The result was the AH-64 Apache. It shared almost no parts with its predecessor, but the DNA was identical. The Apache became the direct heir to a concept paid for in the jungles of Southeast Asia. It refined the hunter-killer tactics born in the Mekong Delta. The line of evolution is short and bloody. It started with crew chiefs leaning out of open doors with M60 machine guns. It moved to improvised Huey gunships. It culminated in the digital cockpit of the most advanced attack helicopter in history. Modern air cavalry exists because of the lessons learned in 1968. The transition from a wooden floorboard to a glass cockpit took less than 20 years.